Hello, and welcome to another edition of our Reading the Signs podcast. I'm Rick Henshaw. With me, as always, is Dr. Jim Dolan, and also with us today, zooming in from the DC Beltway, is my daughter, Clare Hinshaw. Clare is the Legacy Society and Development Relations Director for Young America's Foundation. And from that vantage point, she'll be contributing to our topic of discussion today, which is 4 years after the overturning of Roe versus Wade, where stands the pro-life cause today? It was June 24th, 2022, when the court ruled in the Dobbs decision upholding a Mississippi law that restricted abortion after 15 weeks, that there was in fact no basis for Roe's finding of a constitutional right to abortion. That was a kind of an earth-shaking development 50 years after the court had promulgated Roe versus Wade. And we're going to talk about what's happened since then and perhaps what we can expect going forward. Jim, kick it off for us.
Thank you, Rick, and thank you, Claire, for being with us today. It's truly an honor to have someone who's representing YAF to be with us on this show. Now, as I say the word YAF, back in the day, your dad and I go back many, many years. We go back to the 1970s knowing one another. And YAF back then was called Young Americans for Freedom. And your dad just referred to it as Young Americans Foundation. Is the correct name ending with freedom or foundation, if you don't mind clarifying?
Well, a little of both. Yes. So back in the 60s, Young Americans for Freedom was founded by the great William F. Buckley Jr. at his home in Sharon, Connecticut. And Young America's Foundation kind of grew out of that as the nonprofit organization that helped students on campuses bring speakers to their campuses. We host events. President Reagan actually hosted our signature National Conservative Student Conference at the White House every year of his presidency. But then in, I believe, the 90s, the organizations kind of merged again. And so now Young Americans for Freedom is the name that we use for our student groups on campuses. And the umbrella organization is Young America's Foundation.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that clarification.
Claire, we have an interesting personal story the day that Roe versus Wade was overturned. I was down visiting you that week, but on that particular day, I was off in Richmond playing golf with an old college buddy, and I was not aware of the ruling until we came off the golf course and I got in my car, looked at my phone, and saw messages from you and our son, your brother Joe, out in Wisconsin, informing me that Roe had been overturned. It was kind of ironic because, I was active in the pro-life movement when Roe was first promulgated and active for 50 years trying to get that overturned. And here it was being overturned, and you were on top of it. In fact, you then went with some colleagues to the Supreme Court building to counter the rather raucous pro-abortion demonstrations that were taking place there. While I was on the golf course, blissfully unaware that this ruling that I had been working and advocating for 50 years had finally happened. So it was maybe kind of a symbolic passing of the torch. You were the one that was out there greeting it and celebrating it, while I was desperately and unsuccessfully trying to make a par. So, what were you expecting that day would happen going forward? And now, 4 years later, what has happened? Has it been, have there been positive developments, disappointments, and where do we go from here?
Sure. Yeah, it was an interesting experience. Yeah, as you said, we by the time my colleagues and I got down to the Supreme Court, because we didn't know what day this ruling was going to come down, so we were kind of waiting for the announcement before we headed down. A lot of the other pro-life groups were already out there waiting, and they had dissipated by the time we got there, and it was just us against all of the pro-abortion people. But that actually made for kind of a good time. Got into some good conversations. Sometimes a little more hostile conversations, but still good. And I think, like a lot of people in the pro-life movement, I think a lot of pro-life leaders in the past few years, as as pro-lifers, as at least the three of us I know are all conservatives, uh, we have a tendency to be a little more on the pessimistic side, maybe a little more dour. And I think a lot of pro-lifers in the past few years have really kind of wagged the finger at our movement that we weren't prepared for this, we weren't ready to go. And in thinking about that, I said, yes and no. Could we have been better prepared? Of course. And I think, like a lot of pro-lifers, I wasn't necessarily expecting Roe to be overturned anytime soon, maybe not even in my lifetime. We thought we were kind of in for the long haul with this. At the same time, there were a lot of what we called trigger laws ready to go in many states, in more conservative pro-life states, that immediately enacted bans on abortion, restrictions on abortion. And so there were pros and cons after Roe was overturned. It was a great symbolic victory, a great motivational victory. But I think a lot of kind of the foot soldiers in the pro-life movement who maybe are very pro-life personally, but they're not as much activists, maybe were not aware that, well, this isn't the end goal. And that was where we weren't as well prepared for what was coming next. And I think the biggest thing that we've seen since the overturning of Roe is that while we've made a lot of gains, especially in more pro-life states, with shutting down surgical abortion centers, restrictions on surgical abortions, we've seen chemical abortions, these medication abortions really surge. And that's the real battle now, where I think we were aware of that before Roe, but we thought, well, our big battle is just going to be the states. And that is still a front in the war, if you will. But even in pro-life states now, the chemical abortions are surging, the mail order abortions, and that seems to be the big thing that we were not as prepared for.
So, Claire, the ease with which someone is able to have an abortion now by sending away for the medications that will kill the unborn, it's much more difficult to stop someone who's on the verge of having an abortion, like we could have in the past, maybe caught, so to speak, or seen the woman as she's entering the abortion mill and tried to talk her out of it. We have less and less of an opportunity to do that as we did in the past. So what is the newer strategy for trying to get to women who are abortion minded to help them to see the pro-life alternative?
That's definitely the trickiest part. And I think for those who are in states where there are still abortion clinics, like I am, going and praying and sidewalk counseling outside of those is still the best thing to do. But I think just finding people where they are. At YAF, we work a lot on the college campuses, and it's been one of the privileges, probably the highlight of my career this far, that I've been able to help develop our pro-life outreach on campuses and even in high schools with this display, our pro-life timeline that shows the development of a child before birth. And our students set that up and use it to start conversations with their fellow students. And it's at that age, those high school and college ages, where women are probably most at risk for abortion because they're most at risk, so to speak, for unplanned pregnancies. So, but even if a woman doesn't encounter that issue while she's in college, being exposed to the pro-life arguments and the realities of life before birth and the realities of abortion earlier in her life, in those high school and college years, if she finds herself in a difficult situation later in life, that seed will already have been planted. Aside from that, I think things like what you're doing, having a podcast, posting things online, just putting this information out as widely as possible where people are, which is on the internet and YouTube, actually, where I know this podcast is going to be posted, is the number one social media site for young people. So these are the ways to kind of spread that message as far and wide as possible. And then just in your personal life, anyone you encounter where an opportunity arises to have those evangelizing conversations, we just have to be ready to take those. St. Peter says in one of my favorite Bible verses that you always have to be ready to give a reason for your hope and do so with gentleness and reverence. And he's, of course, talking about the gospel, but it applies to the right to life too. We always need to be ready to give a reason why we're pro-life, why we have hope in life, and to make that defense with gentleness and reverence whenever the opportunity arises.
Yeah, Claire, you touched on something that's very important, which is that people maybe people not actively involved in the pro-life movement did not understand that simply overturning Roe did not, in and of itself, prevent one abortion. All it did was say that the Supreme Court in 1973 way overstepped its bounds by taking this issue out of the public sector, out of the people's involvement in their government through the legislative process, and simply decreeing from on high that there was a constitutional right to abortion that is nowhere found or even hinted at in the Constitution. But all Roe did was re-empower us to try to work to change laws. Now, in some states, that was trying to restore the laws that had never been repealed when Roe, but they simply couldn't be enforced after Roe. But even that led to court battles. In many other states, we need to work legislatively. And one of the things that stands out for me that you might want to comment on is that I think most surveys show that I think a majority of Americans are still profoundly uncomfortable with abortion and especially with widespread abortion. But after 50 years of Roe, the majority is not comfortable with the idea of abortion being outlawed, of not having access to abortion. Some want it widely available for any reason, some want it in certain cases, but they can't imagine there being no possibility of getting an abortion. Uh, so, that being the case, they when Roe was in existence, it was kind of a firewall, and such people could support certain reasonable restrictions, maybe a time limit on abortion, or a ban on things like sex selection abortions, or parental consent or notification before a minor could have an abortion. But now, any even minimalist restrictions on abortion are presented by the pro abortionists as this is going to be the end of any opportunity to get an abortion. Now, obviously, from a pro-life standpoint, we ultimately want to see every innocent unborn child's life protected, but we're nowhere near that, and yet people are unwilling to support even minor restrictions now because they're being told that it's all going to lead to a complete ban on abortion. So how do we combat that while moving closer to a point where people begin to accept the idea that it would be a good thing to protect every unborn human life? You touched on one thing, the marvelous educational material that YAF presents about the development of life in the womb. But what else do we need to do to kind of rekindle public support for protecting unborn human life?
Yeah, it's an important question. And I think one element of YAF's pro-life timeline that I mentioned before is that the way we set it up, we ask anyone walking by, or our students would ask them, at which stage of development do you think life begins? And if the person they're talking to says, well, 9 weeks, then our student will ask them, well, why 9 weeks? What is it about 9 weeks that makes this a human life? Let's walk this back. This is actually a technique that I learned from you originally. But let's walk this back. Why not the stage of development right before 9 weeks? Why not 6 weeks? Why not 8 weeks? Why not 8 weeks and 6 days? Why not the minute before 9 weeks? And I think that helps to kind of take these, as you say, kind of like common sense, reasonable restrictions, as many people, many moderates would classify them, and say, okay, well, you say that it's okay to restrict abortion after the heartbeat begins. Well, why not before? Let's look at what life looks like before that. So that I think is the first thing to kind of extend. You start with the reasonable restrictions, and then you walk back from that to better educate on the realities of life from conception, so that now suddenly the reasonable restrictions become greater and greater until you're at a full abortion ban. The other thing, this is kind of a hobby horse of mine and maybe a little controversial, but I really think at this point in the pro-life movement and where our country is at and where the culture is at, I think the pro-life movement needs to make a conscious effort to put more pro-life male leaders out there. The strategy of the pro-life movement for many years, which makes sense, was to put women at the forefront because this is categorized by the left as a women's issue. But where I see the culture and young people, especially today, is that young men desperately need good male role models and they need to see what a real man is. And to have men standing up and speaking out for the right to life, for the unborn, for the vulnerable is so important for getting young men into the pro-life movement and stepping up as leaders, not just in the movement, but in their families, in the culture. And I also learned when I was training to be a sidewalk counselor outside the abortion clinics, the women going into the clinics actually often respond better to male sidewalk counselors because these women are typically going into these abortion clinics because their fathers are not standing up for them, because their boyfriends or their husbands are encouraging them to get these abortions. They're being used by the men in their lives, and that's what they've gotten used to. And for the first time outside the abortion clinic, they're encountering a man who has nothing to gain from being there and helping them and is just selflessly giving of himself at 6 a.m. in the cold, in the rain, trying to help her just because he cares about her. And that can make a huge impact on a woman. So that's my hot take, as they say, is that we need more male pro-life leaders out there as well.
Well, I'm so glad to hear you raise that point, Claire, because your dad and I have talked about that on a number of our shows, is how abortion becomes very uncommon when the father of the unborn child is involved in a positive way. So it's an understated role that the dad and the men in general need to play. I was telling your dad also earlier that it's interesting that when we do a comparison of the 1970s, the state of mind of women, what's the happiness level of women in the 1970s compared to today, studies after studies show that women today are less happy than they were in the 1970s. So they seem to have been caught up in this culture that sees abortion as a solution, as a viable life path toward happiness, and it just hasn't worked out. Uh, so we, and I was also glad to hear you say about how YAF does education of and support and advocacy for conservative students on our campuses. So all too often they're being shut down, or their positions or views are not even being acknowledged or supported. So I'm very glad to hear that YAF, your organization, also tries to empower and support youngsters in that situation. But along the lines of providing the education, along with also pointing out the life stage of the unborn child, letting women know that going against God's will is inherently unhealthy. It's inherently going to make you unhappy. It's inherently going to make you more depressed. And as you probably know, I am a psychotherapist. And I'm oftentimes saying to my patients that when you're depressed, it's your healthy side actually trying to get your attention to let you know that a course needs to be corrected, that you need to break into a new vista, into a new mindset. And so the depression, the sadness that women experience much more commonly now than they did in the 1970s, their awareness needs to be raised to the fact that they're living their lives in many instances in contrast to God's will, and that's the source of their unhappiness. So thank you for letting me give that little speech.
Yes.
If I could jump in on that, because, one of the things shortly after Dobbs, when, it seemed like the pro-life movement was not advancing much, and the columnist Daniel McCarthy, a conservative columnist who I think writes very well, and he wrote a column saying one of the things we've got to do if we want to regenerate pro-life efforts and pro-life values in this country is to get more people going back to church. Now, the interesting thing is, Jim and I have talked about, and we both agree that abortion at bottom is a human rights issue. You don't have to have a religious faith to be pro-life. The great Nat Hentop, the great civil libertarian and atheist, strongly pro-life. And Dr. Nathanson, before he found God, changed his commitment to abortion, became pro-life. But the idea that always in great human rights movements, religion has played a role, churches have played a role because faith calls us to our better selves, to our better angels, if you will. And Daniel McCarthy is right. There's been a decline, certainly over the past decade, in people going to church and being actively religious. And that's got to hurt a movement like the pro-life cause because it is so totally selfless. Any other movement for justice also involves the people who are being treated unjustly. The civil rights movement led by oppressed blacks in America with other Americans joining in, but the people who are being oppressed were able to advocate for themselves. The unborn cannot. Everybody who gets involved for them is working totally to protect somebody else, not themselves. That's hard for a lot of people to do when they don't feel a self-interest. But if they're people of faith, they're drawn to things like that. So let's hear further thoughts from you.
Yes, absolutely. And that really speaks to me. I remember even as a kid, I always had this desire to do something, to change the world. I wanted a cause. And once I was old enough to know and understand what abortion was, I realized this is it. This is the cause. But I think all human beings have that desire to some extent. We certainly all have a desire for meaning and purpose in our lives, and that's generally found outside of ourselves. There's the expression that a man wrapped up in himself makes a very small package indeed. And that's what I think we find as human beings is we need something outside of ourselves to give ourselves to. But that's uncomfortable and it can be hard to push ourselves outside that little box of ourselves. And that is where faith comes in and it gives us that kind of baseline of meaning and baseline of a reason to go beyond ourselves to take that first step. I remember back in college, I went to Franciscan University, and one of Franciscan's kind of calling cards is our households, which the easiest way to describe them is that they're like faith-based sororities and fraternities. And I joined a household called Madonna of the Streets, which was focused on the new evangelization and particularly on pro-life work. And we had the most commitments of any female household on campus. Like, if you were going to join MOS, you had to be all in because it was going to take a lot of your time and energy. But we found we also became one of the biggest households on campus because that's what people are searching for is people want to do more. They want to give of themselves, but they need a reason and they need an opportunity. And I think the pro-life movement really offers that.
Claire, talk from your vantage point down there in the Beltway outside Washington about the political situation when it comes to abortion. What I'm thinking of is, after Dobbs, the liberal pro-abortion, mostly Democrats, just dove headlong in. They were going to protect a woman's right to abortion. And many of the Republicans, even some conservative Republicans, with some notable exceptions, uh, kind of headed for the tall grass. They headed for the hills. They didn't want to, and they began hiding behind the idea of states' rights. This is a state issue now. It's gone back to the states, and there's nothing that we can do about it in Washington. But then, even at the state level, you had some great leaders like Ron DeSantis in Florida, Governor Kemp in Georgia, who pushed through heartbeat bills to protect babies at least once their hearts started beating. But you had many others, even at the state level, who did not want it to be an issue. They were afraid, they were convinced that it was a losing issue and were not willing to stand up on it. Now, I wrote a column right after Dobbs when this was in the air, and I said it will be a losing issue if the Republicans, the pro-lifers, run away from it, because if they seem afraid of the issue, uh, then nobody's going to respect them. The pro-aborts are not going to ease up and vote for them when they have hardline pro-abortion Democrats on the ticket. And pro-lifers are going to be turned off and say, well, he's afraid to do anything for us. Why should we? Maybe we'll end up voting for him by default because he won't be as bad as a Democrat, but we're not going to roll up our sleeves and try to help him get elected. So it seems like it was a self-defeating approach, and yet it's something that a lot of ostensibly pro-life Republicans seem to be holding on to from my vantage point. What about from where you sit?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think in some ways this is just kind of the realities of politicians is that I think it was Senator Jim Buckley said you either go to Washington to do something or to be something. And so many politicians, even if they have good intentions when they start out, once you get elected, you're immediately thinking about the next election. And it makes you very cautious and sometimes overly cautious. And it's funny because I think it's kind of the prevailing wisdom that you gotta kind of tiptoe around these controversial issues. But what you actually see is that, and I think especially with the younger generations, authenticity is very important to Gen Z, which is the generation that's coming up now. And when they look at these politicians who are kind of trying to play both sides and tiptoe around difficult issues, it's really a turnoff. Whereas when you have someone come out and speak clearly, someone who obviously knows what they're talking about and has their convictions, even if you disagree with those convictions, there's a certain respect there for most people. If you see someone who's intelligent and principled, you can respect that. And that inspires a lot more confidence in a voter than someone who is kind of tiptoeing around and playing both sides. I'm a big fan of the Daily Wire. As you know, I listen to a lot of Michael Knowles, and he says if you stand in the middle of the street, you're going to get run over. You need to figure out where you stand and then stand proudly. That doesn't mean that you should always be open to new evidence, of course, and open to changing your opinion if you're proven wrong on something. But you need to take a stand somewhere. You need to have integrity. And that speaks much better to voters than the middle of the road does. So I think for politicians, you really, if you want to be successful, you have to have the courage to go against the prevailing wisdom. Um, and that means taking a stand for life.
I think it was Pat Buchanan back in the 90s, even, who talked about these kinds of Republicans, and he said, those who turn their backs on the silent screams of the unborn will turn their backs on the rest of the promises they've made to us sooner or later. Jim, we're just about out of time. Any quick closing
Just
thoughts?
add a final thought before you close the show, Rick. I just want to point out, as I did in the last show, that if there's one thing we know about God, is that he must create. And he looks to partner with us in the creative process. That's the one thing everyone has to recognize, that a truth about God. It can't be argued against that that's God's purpose. And I think that's clear. So there are people on the pro-abortion side who try to argue, as they did in the period of time of slavery, that somehow slavery and racism was allowed by God. It was a good thing. There's people on the pro-abortion side who will argue that the killing of the unborn is a good thing. But if we go back to the roots, and we go back to the foundation, that the one thing we know about God is that he must create, and he looks to partner with us in that process. We cannot go against that truth.
Thank you, Jim. Claire, thank you so much for being with us today. Thank all of you for joining us. And tune in again 2 weeks from now, when I think we're going to be talking about the Pope's recent encyclical. So thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again.